So, Steve, imagine you saw a guy in a coffee shop. He's got a coat that's held together by a safety pin. Next to him is a guy that's bought him a coffee out of pity. What would you assume about his bank account?
Doesn't have money for coffee, probably doesn't have much money in his bank account.
Right. Most people would assume he's broke. But the irony is that man was Ronald Read. And for those who haven't heard of that name before, when he died, he had $8 million. You're talking about a guy in a coffee shop who was wearing a coat put together with safety pins. That man was a millionaire, not just a millionaire, multimillionaire. And it's kind of ironic to me that the guy who bought him coffee probably had a lease on a BMW, maybe $15,000 in credit card debt. That's the illusion of wealth. And if you think about it from that perspective, I mean, what can we glean from Robert Reed? I feel like there's a story here that I'm missing.
Well, there's several underlying points there. And the first word that comes to my mind is discipline. That's what so many people lack these days when it comes to investing. He had the discipline to control his spending, to not spend when he didn't have to. And if you look today, as a matter of fact, I wasn't as familiar with that story until you brought it up. But from my own personal experience, I can, I was contrast two different clients that I worked with. One of them was an individual, maybe not too much different from him, that he had a body shop, and it was in the garage, literally next to his house. And he never, at that point, never made more than $30,000 in a year. It's been 10 years or so, but he'd never made more than 30,000. And yet he was debt free. He had money. He had income. He had stability. He had emergency, backup assets. He had several $100,000 available if he needed it because he was disciplined and frugal. Now, contrast that with a doctor I worked with, again, close to the same time. That's why I always compare these two. He's making a little over $400,000 a year, and it looked destitute. He didn't look destitute. He looked like he had money. He had a fancy car, had a fancy house, had did all this, did this and this, all the toys and boats and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, he could barely pay the bills every month. And so the income does not translate into wealth. And that's what a lot of people misunderstand. They think doctors make a bunch of money, they're wealthy. Not necessarily. And so that's a lot of it comes down to discipline.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I think there's so many people and audiences, mass audiences aren't particularly receptive to a doctor crying about poverty, right? But simultaneously, so many of them get into a situation where they're chasing having way too many things at once. And if anything, they have, the opposite of freedom or independence because they have the burden of all the things they're trying to do simultaneously. But the person that you mentioned that's making, made 30,000 a year, I mean, that kind of feels like the story of, Reed here that we were just talking about. I
Yeah,
mean, you're talking about
absolutely.
someone, he was a gas station attendant and mechanic. And, after that, he took a brief break, I believe, and then he was a part-time janitor. Like, it's kind of a crazy story to think about that, but it's also very aspirational. But it's also a little confusing to me because it's not just being frugal. You talk about being disciplined. I mean, what else is it,
Yeah,
about his story to show that anyone can do that?
well, I say discipline, and I want to kind of add a part two to that because sometimes discipline scares people away. It doesn't sound like fun. You can still have fun. What I show people how to do a lot of times is when you have a budget, when money comes in, you have a percentage that goes to your essential expenses, your house payment, your car payment, insurance, utilities, stuff like that. And then you have your fun stuff. That's your fun money. That might be going out to dinner, that might be traveling, that might be a hobby you enjoy, whatever that might be. And then you've got another percentage, maybe it's 10% or so that goes into an emergency fund until you have that built up. And then you got, 10 or 15% that goes into investments. And so by breaking it down that way, you're not trying to track every single expense. Just, hey, is this crucial? Is this an essential expense or is this a fun expense? And then this always goes into investing. And if you look at his standpoint, what anyone can do is it comes down to those decisions. And, when I bought my last car, I could have got a really nice car. I like my car. It's a brand new, I got a deal on it. It's a brand new Subaru and I like it. It gets great gas mileage. It's reliable. It's comfortable. And I got it for like 300 something a month. And so what that does, and when you look at that budgeting standpoint, that's an essential payment. I had to have a car. But instead of getting a car that was 600 or 800 a month or 1,000 a month, I got one in the 300s. That just freed up $600 a month for my fun stuff. And so it's not about not having fun. It's about having a structured approach so you can balance what you have to have with what's fun to have. And then, of course, I always have money going into investments as well. And so, from that standpoint, Ronald, so what Ronald did, he probably had something similar, and maybe his fund percentage was really small, but he was mostly just paying for the essentials. And he probably had a much larger percentage going into investments than most people would even think about. So maybe instead of 10% of his income, he may have been putting 50% of his income. It's all those same things. Everyone, in some way, shape, or form, you've really got your essential expenses, your fun expenses, and then your savings and investing. And each one of those are just different allocations that you decide how you want to live your life. The doctor, he went all for, basically essentials and fun. He had no money left over, and frankly, he probably had too much fun. But when you reduce your essential expenses, again, you get that next car for less. Now you've got more money for investing or more money for fun.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I would say with the rise of social media, it kind of brings a question to my mind. Is it harder to avoid status symbols or having too much fun today versus 20 or 30 years ago?
Absolutely. And it's not just social media. Yes, social media is a big part of it. People always sharing, hey, I'm out doing this, and I was having fun. That looks, if everyone wants to be part of the fun, but it's also the marketers and advertisers. They've gotten better. They have better data. They know who does what, when they do it, why they do it, and how they do it. And they're going to target you for the exact things that you're going to have a hard time saying no to because they know they've got that data. And so you look at those things, and yeah, we're always being harassed, for lack of a better word, by people who want to sell us stuff. And so it's, again, the advertisers have gotten better, the social media influence, you add all that together, and yeah, it's hard to maintain your budget in a responsible manner.
Right. It makes me think, that sort of difficulty. I'm thinking about AI. AI is always a trendy topic at this point. And now, of course, people are utilizing AI to make it that much more likely that you want to buy something.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're left a week, 2 weeks. I think about many of us who have children. They say, well, why do you want that? And, the child doesn't really know because it's in front of me, and they come up with some sort of reason. And then a few hours later, they're bored with it or they never touch it again. And it's not just children that do that, right? Adults will do it too, where ultimately it's not nearly as satisfying of a purchase as they first thought it was. But it really does strike me as quite the interesting story when we're talking about Mr. Read. When we look at that and we say, man, this guy, he donated of his $8 million when he died, he donated 6 million of that, and the other 2 million, he gave to his stepchildren and his lawyer, his family. Nobody knew he was wealthy. He wasn't really focused on that pursuit of trying to show that he made it. He was actually more than satisfied to realize that without having to broadcast it. Is there anything that you take away from that?
Well, again, we had the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses." I mean, everyone wants people to think, "Hey, I deserve to be here. I deserve to have this nice car. Look at me." Again, not always out of vanity, but just you don't want people. Most people don't want to be viewed as poor guy. He doesn't have any money. That sort of thing. Most people don't want to be viewed like that, so they are going to drive a car, live in a house, or do things that are going to give that perception that they've got money. And I'm not a psychiatrist, but I'm sure we could have a psychiatrist on here sometime and just go deep into why that is. There's a term, no, a little bit of psychology, but there's a term about that, just how you feel about yourself. And so that could be involved, could be with that. But there's something where he was so comfortable with who he was and what he had that he had no need to try and show anything more to other people.
Well, the part of what you're saying there that evokes to me is the concept of, people talk about how they need some retail therapy. Sometimes it's a matter of wanting to go buy something so you can feel some sense of accomplishment from that for some period of time. But then the other side, you brought up, keeping up with the Joneses, and I think it's ubiquitous with this concept of, the very nature of social media. People are scrolling, whether it's Instagram or TikTok. They're seeing people with all these sort of fabulous things. And it naturally has this gravity, right, that forces them to say, hey, what can I buy or what can I do to have that little bit of flex to strangers? Because there's something validating about having a million people liking something, liking your post, for example, when they don't really have any idea who you actually are in the real world. And, if we contrast that again to Ronald, right? He didn't have an iPhone. An iPhone, was just coming around, as he passed away. But what he did have was a library card. And so instead of focusing on comparing himself to others, what he was doing in his free time, he's reading the Wall Street Journal, he's reading Barron's, he's studying. And, there's something very constructive about it, what it allowed him to do. He's finding companies to own so he could quietly take care of his family. You have one, lifestyle feeds the ego, you have the other, it feeds the portfolio. And ultimately, which one is going to be, more powerful in the end. I mean,
Uh,
what would you say to any
Frank,
of that part of the story?
well, I was going to say, and frankly, I probably could have guessed that, without knowing it, because you don't accumulate $8 million just out of, hey, I set some money aside in the stock market. He had to have knowledge and tell people, one of the formulas for success is the capital you have multiplied by the knowledge you have about money multiplied by the amount of time that you put into it. And so as he was building his capital, he was gaining the knowledge and putting time into it. Those two things amplified the capital that he did have. And so what most people do, unfortunately, is just the opposite. Maybe they have a little bit of capital, but with today's technology, today's easy tools, I could go on and open a Robinhood account, make some trades, and not have any idea whatsoever what I'm doing. The technology is there. It's easy to do, but I could do it with almost no time and with no knowledge whatsoever other than how to use an app. And I think that's the dangerous part from a lot of people today is like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a trader. I saw a video on that and it explained in 10 minutes how to become a professional trader. Did it? It told you how to create an account and what to do, but that's not the same. And I think a lot of people are trying for those shortcuts. They try and skip the knowledge or, skip the time. One of my favorite quotes is from Richest Man in Babylon, one of my favorite books on investing. And it said, only invest in something in which you are an expert or you have a trusted advisor who is. So think about that. If you go back to his situation, he made sure that he was the expert. So I think you said he invested in blue chip stocks. He read Barron's, he did Wall Street Journal, and he knew what he was doing. He gained that knowledge, and that's fantastic. And so if you're going to invest, this being you, anyone who's listening, if you're going to invest, either invest in something that you know really well, or you've got an advisor who knows that really well. If you can't say yes to one of those two things, then don't put your money in it. And again, that goes back to the Robinhood example earlier. No criticism of Robinhood. I've got an account myself. But most people, that's just such an easy way to invest, but with no knowledge.
Right. There's so many layers with everything that you just talked about there. On the one hand, what's great about Robinhood, right, and being able to do trades without, commissions attached to it, is it opens up even people who have very limited income to invest. They can start and they can chip away at it and have that cascade or that snowball effect. That's very powerful. But when we look at the aspiration of wanting to be a day trader and the money that you can make and lose very quickly, I think the challenge is that, when you treat the stock market as an example as gambling, then, you're playing a probability game where a lot of people at some point have a rude awakening because they're jumping in without any sort of due diligence.
Can I take off on that real quick? What happens in gambling when you go to Las Vegas? The house always wins. A lot of people are thinking, well,
Right.
wait a minute. I've got, an account where I can do free trades. Wow, Fidelity or Robinhood or whatever. That's so nice of them to let me trade for free. I can buy and sell stocks at no cost. Wow, what a great deal. These companies spend billions upon billions advertising. How is that if they're making zero? They're not making zero. They're the house. They've got algorithms and systems and they're doing trading as well. Keep that in mind. They've got, funds, they do a variety of different things. And they know that, if you're out there trading, again, I don't want to sound, controversial or I've never been a conspiracy theory type of person, but just they've got to make money somewhere and they're making a lot of money. And if they're not charging you, how are they making that money? And, I think it's from trading and doing things like that, knowing that most traders don't make money. And so just keep that in mind that they've got to make their money somewhere. And if it's like, use a gambling analogy, it's the house wins and they're the house, somebody has to lose. And that's why I've never been a big fan of trading.
One of the classic things for a retail investor, not to get off topic too much, but is that, the market is designed to steal your money. And if you don't have discipline with it, it's fair to make that argument that it very well can have that effect.
Can I share one more thing real quick? Because
Yeah.
there was a study done by, I believe it was Fidelity, that actually looked at hundreds of thousands, if not millions of accounts over many years to determine which types of accounts made the most money. And what they were able to figure out is that the two types of accounts that made the most money were the people who had forgotten they had the account, or they'd passed away. In other words, the people who just let the money sit and grow and do nothing. And the people who are doing trading all the time, moving money all around, trying to time the market, buying on emotion usually, or selling on emotion, using fear and greed, all those different things, they're all losing money in the market. And so again, I'm not against investing in the market, but the dollar cost average, put money in, let it grow, don't touch it, don't trade it. That is a more sound strategy than trying to trade and use, whether it's Fidelity, Robinhood, or any of those. But to take it back to Ronald, was he moving money around every day? No, he put money in and he let it sit for years. That's what works.
Right. And once again, if you have those classic stock certificates, a stock certificate, right? I mean, back in the day, anyone who was a stockholder of Disney, you would literally get the classic stock certificate. And then as everything went digital or electronic, Disney went to a point where they stopped sending out stock certificates if you were a shareholder. But if you're holding it that way, where you have to go through multiple steps, you're able to have this level of discipline versus panic selling when there's a bad day or 2 days, right? And there's that classic adage, time in the market versus timing the market, that it's easy to forget about, especially with the amount of advertisement today about the next greatest tech company or crypto opportunity or whatever else.
Did you say those stock certificates applied to Ronald?
Yeah, right. He physically held his stock.
Okay.
And so since they were, in a safe deposit box, right, and he physically held it, it made it that much easier for him to avoid panic selling during the market crashes of, say 87 or 2008, right? Instead, what was he doing? He was buying more.
Right.
And I think that that's part to it, right? And so if you think about it, like the lesson there is that, he didn't beat the market by being faster, right, than Wall Street. He beat it by essentially utilizing the lack of liquidity to make it easier to be disciplined.
That's right. So from years ago, again, you can't do well. It's different than it would be today, but one of the really common strategies from years ago was when you set up a savings account, don't put that savings account in your bank. Go to a bank that's 30 miles away. And so that if you ever have to take a withdrawal, you have to stop and think about it and you have to plan for it as opposed to just, go make a withdrawal. Well, now it's so easy. If you have an emergency account at your bank, it's like, I need to move money over, click send. So it's hard to maintain an emergency account, a savings account when it's that easy to move money around. But, so it's kind of like the stock certificate story you were talking about with him, where it was a little harder for him to sell those, which was probably a good thing.
Well, and the other thing that I was thinking about, within his story, we've talked about, being disciplined, always focusing on contributing something to investing to allow it to grow. But, thus far within this story, the focus is on stocks primarily as the vehicle that worked for him. Now, if we look at, here we are almost 20 years, later when we're talking about 2008 and so forth. And there's a lot of different vehicles that are out today. And so I think it's important to look at the history of what worked for his journey, but simultaneously to think about some disadvantages that he, didn't have, or opportunities that he didn't have that could have been available to him today. Right. And some of that goes back to a lot of the cash flow first approach that we utilize with investing, with the unbroken investing philosophy. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, and it's not even necessarily, unbroken investing. Our main thing is diversification. And so you talk about other assets. I mean, go back, 10, 15, 20 years in anything. If you had bought gold and just let it sit, yeah, it would have had ups and downs, but where would it be now? It'd be up, way up. If you bought Bitcoin 15 years ago and just did nothing, not traded it, not moved it, buried it in the backyard, and haven't touched it in 15 years, you know, What was it at 15 years ago? 30 bucks, $50, and now it's, yeah, it dropped from 80,000 to 65,000. That sucks. But if you got in at 65, you're up a thousandfold. And so
Right.
many things over time they do that. But again, a lot of people just don't have the patience. Now, when it comes to cash flow, that's where you've got the reinvesting of it, and all right, what are you going to do with it? So you've generated passive cash flow. Are you going to reinvest that and compound that? And over time, again, that just balloons tremendously. Or are you going to take that out and diversify that elsewhere? Again, one of the things I've talked to clients about is they have an asset that's generating a bunch of cash flow. Great. What are you going to do with that? Well, let's dollar cost average some of this into index funds. And let's dollar cost average some of this into this asset over here. Let's put some into your 401k, different things like that. And so it's not just getting the cash flow, it's what are you going to do with that cash flow to continue creating that wealth.
Yeah, the analogy that I've heard before, it actually goes back to bamboo. And I don't know if this is 100% accurate or not, but it's just this is a story as it was described. With bamboo, it grows underground, taking years to form roots. Looks like nothing is happening. Then all of a sudden, it shoots up 80 feet in 6 weeks. And you have this big, massive explosion, right? The exponential growth. And the power of compounding, within investing, a lot of those same sort of things can happen where if you continue to work at it, you get that growth. If you combine that with the diversification strategy that you're talking about with assets that also generate cash flow, you have that ability to accelerate some of those things even faster. Does that kind of stimulate anything to mind for you?
Other than, yes, I agree 100%. Other than that, I mean, that's exactly the way it works. And, with real estate, with owning a business, I mean, those are the two ways that you can create an amazing amount of wealth. And, putting money into those, again, are you going to make that amazing amount of wealth tomorrow? No. But are you going to make it over time? And then, like you said, accelerating over the years. I mean, think about, a house these days that's worth, the average house in America is worth over $400,000 now. Well, the average growth rate is 4% per year. That means that the average house is gaining $16,000 a year of equity. That's pretty impressive. Now, what was that number 20 years ago? It was a lot smaller, because houses were worth less, because it is, like, to your point, it's gone up at a accelerating rate. But that's just one quick example. But yeah, over time, but it all starts with cash flow, compounding, and building over time.
One other thing that I think about, with the story that we've talked about today, it goes back to the fact, well, you have someone who was frugal and, that was a lifestyle that worked really well for them. But ultimately, when he passed away at 92, he had that $8 million. And some people might look at that story and they ignore the success part, right? They ignore the fact that he was a multimillionaire, that he had $8 million. Instead, they say, well, he died and he didn't spend any of that money. And from that perspective, like, what is your takeaway from that? What's the point of dying rich if you lived like a janitor?
Well, and the key here is everybody gets to choose. But that's the thing. You've got to have the money to make that choice. In other words, if you want to save money like he did and be frugal, with the plans of giving it away to charity when you pass away, then that is your choice. But the way I look at it, a lot of people heard the saying, money can't buy happiness. True. But it can pay for the things that bring you joy. And so with me personally, do I plan on sitting around and just accumulating millions and millions of dollars that I'm going to, die with $8 million when I'm 92 years old? No, I'm going to spend it and have fun. But I'm also going to spend the amount that is based on the passive cash flow that I'm getting so that it will last. Now, when I pass away, will I have 8 million? I don't know. Could be more, could be less, but I will have had a blast during that before then. And again, that goes back to that budgeting part. All right, here's the essential budget. Here's the fun budget. Here's the investing budget. And so, again, my wife and I were travel addicts. That's our favorite thing that we do. And so we'll spend a lot more money on travel than he would have. And again, maybe he had other hobbies. Who knows? But I can't sit here and say, yeah, you should all do what he did, because to me, that doesn't sound like a fun life. He may have enjoyed it, but that doesn't sound like a fun life to me. But that's where everyone gets to make the choice of what's fun for them. But I can tell you what's not fun is not having the money or having the fear that you're never going to be financially independent, or that you're going to, even worse, run out of money before you pass away.
Well, from that perspective, the big thing that, my big takeaway from what you just described goes back to the word optionality. And what wealth gives us is optionality. And, there's plenty of wealthy people that don't look wealthy while they're building it. And simultaneously, we have to be careful not to let lifestyle inflation quietly destroy wealth creation too. And at the end of the day, if we have someone who genuinely enjoyed, the way that he lived his life, and then had that payoff where he was able to keep on growing and then donate that to charity and set up, his children with multi generational wealth, so to speak. Like, that's also a very good thing. And that's the way that he approached it. Um, if we kind of think about, wrapping up today, what do you have any other kind of takeaways from, the story that we kind of looked at?
Well, again, you use the word optionality, and that's what I like. Again, he had gained the knowledge and put the time into creating wealth, which gave him the options to do what he wanted to do with it. If he'd wanted to travel, he could have traveled. If he had wanted to do other things, if he had hobbies, whatever they were, he could have done those because he had those options. He chose to save it and give it to charity and his heirs when he passed away. That's fine. But he created those options as he gained the knowledge and the time and put time into creating that wealth. And I think that's the part that I would put the emphasis on, is what are you doing to make sure that you are creating that wealth, creating that passive cash flow so that you've got options. So that's how I look at it from my standpoint.
Right. I look at it as the other really key part about all this goes back to discipline, having a plan. And, we have this textbook example of someone who didn't become wealthy because they made an extraordinary income. He became wealthy because of that discipline, because he focused on diversifying into real assets. He avoided unnecessary consumption that took away from his ability to drive towards that things. And then time and the compounding, right, really worked in his favor to build something very large.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw out one really quick contrast there. Lottery winners. I share this example a lot. Most lottery winners, I want to say it's 75 or 80%, are bankrupt within 5 years. So you have someone making, say, $50,000 a year, they win $1 million. That should last them 20 years, and yet they're bankrupt in 5. The reason is because they never had that discipline. They never had that plan. They never learned about money the way that Ronald did. And so they actually got the money, squandered it, and wasted it, and were right back where they started. Whereas he started with no money, but gained the knowledge, gained the skills, and became wealthy.
Right. And, it also reminds me of something else that you talk about a lot too, right? It's, the difference between income and wealth, right? The goal is not just to make money, it's also to own things that grow. And that's not necessarily just stocks, right? That can be businesses or real estate. I think that's maybe a future topic, but certainly something to revisit. All that said, I think with that, you know, we're done for today. Anything else you want to add? Any last comments?
No, great topic. I appreciate it. And again, just a good example of, just because you have high income doesn't mean you have wealth. And that's the key that a lot of people don't seem to understand.
Great. Thanks, Steve. We'll catch up again next week.
All right. Thanks, Dave.